Hi, my paper crafting friends. Welcome to Betsy's Paper Craft Room, where we are going to start our pre-cutting for the pumpkin spice card making workshop. I'm going to jump right in and go through what you should have on hand to get started with the paper cuts. Most important, of course, is your paper trimmer. Secondly, are the cutting instructions and diagrams from the card kit. You may not need to have these if you're going to follow along exactly with me, but it's always nice to have them to refer back to. I like to have 4 file folders for gathering the pieces for each card design. The kit makes 4 different card designs, so I will separate the cuts for each design into its correct file folder. It's also recommended that you use a pencil to mark the back of each piece we cut. I don't normally do that with mine, but I'm going to give it a try this time to see if it actually does make a difference in sorting and organizing the papers or assembling the cards. In the kit, we have 16 envelopes and 16 card bases. All my papers have been put in order as they appear on the cutting guide. The 2 pattern pieces are on top, followed by the 2 sheets of papaya cardstock. The 3rd piece is the peach cardstock, and lastly are 2 sheets of white daisy. What I'm going to do first is number my envelopes, 4 of each number, 1 through 4. This way, when it comes time to organize all the pieces into the order we will be making the cards, they will be all ready to go. 4 envelopes are labeled number 1. 4 more envelopes I'm going to label number 2. I just pencil real lightly below the flap on the inside of the envelope. When the envelope is closed, no one will ever see that you've written on it. That's our little secret. These are envelopes for card number 3. Another thing that I do at the very beginning is to fold my card bases and burnish them. And finally, 4 envelopes for card number 4. So we will have 16 cards total with 4 of each 4 designs. Now those are ready to use a little bit later on. You also will need your die cuts and your die cutting machine. I didn't put mine on the table to display because it's heavy, and I thought we'll just share that part later. A bit of washi tape or removable tape will also be helpful when we get to the die cutting. Now the first thing we're going to do here is to cut off the zip strips. Those are the pretty little acorn strips. You may want to determine which side of the paper has the best contrast between the zip strip and the main pattern. I think a good contrast makes it easier to determine where to cut. I'm going to use the white strip side, contrasted against the darker paper. I think that's easier to see exactly where I want to make my cut. Now here is the zip strip after we've cut it. We're going to do this with both pieces of the patterned paper. The zip strips are going to be cut into 3.5 by 1/2 inch pieces. The width is already cut to 1.5, so I'll cut these into 3.5 inch strips. We will get 3 from the first one, leaving a tiny scrap left over. We'll do 1 more 3.5 inch piece from the second zip strip. That will leave a nice piece left over to make additional cards with. According to the instructions, these are pieces 1C, so we'll label them 1C on the backs. 1 is the card number, and C helps identify its position on the card diagram. I'm marking the backs of all those 1C, and now I'm going to put them into the file, folder number 1. The next thing we need is a sheet of the pumpkin spice paper. We do want to make sure that the orientation on this paper matches what is shown on our instructions. You can see on the instructions that the pumpkins have their little stem sides up. That's how we want to be sure our paper is. The little scissors icon right at the top of the diagram indicates what the first cut should be. The first cut is going to be 1 inch. We're actually going to do 2 1-inch cuts, so let's just do both of those cuts right away. In this case, I'm going to use the measurement to the right side of the blade guide, because it's easier to hold onto the paper when cutting smaller strips like this. There we have strip number 1 and strip number 2. From these 2 1-inch strips, we want to get 4 1 by 5.5 inch strips. There's 1, 2, little scrap left over, 3, and 4. Always check the number you're cutting at because paper does not just magically reattach itself if it's cut wrong. These 4 pieces are for card number 2. On the back, we're going to mark them 2A, and then we'll slide them into the folder number 2. Our next cut on here is 4.5 by 3.5. The first number printed is always the length across the top edge of the piece in the diagram, so we will cut at 4.5 inches, still making sure that we have our correct orientation. Okay, so I'm measuring in to 4.5. And again, we're going to do this twice. So let's measure in another 4.5 inches. What I've done here is look ahead. The third cut is 4.5 and the next cut is 4.5 again. The first 4.5 inch strip is going to be cut at 3.5 3 times. We're going to turn this sideways and measure to 3.5 inches. And take 3 cuts. There's 1, cut number 2, and then our third cut at 3.5 inches. We're going to have a little piece of scrap paper left over, and you know that it's scrap because it is white on the diagram. The second piece that is 4.5 inches wide, we're going to cut 1 more piece at 3.5 inches. We should always have at least 4 pieces of whatever size we are cutting because that's what we will need to make 4 of each card. These pieces are all number 1A. So we will label them 1A on the back and toss those into our folder number 1. With the remainder of that 4.5 inch piece, we are going to cut it from 4.5 down to 3.5. The scrap goes aside, and we're making perfect squares out of this, so we need to turn it sideways and make 2 more 3.5 inch cuts in this. We'll put the remaining scrap aside and label these 2 squares as 4B, and then we will place those into folder number 4. Now we'll move along to our second piece of the beautiful pumpkin spice texture paper, making sure the orientation matches the instructions, which is the pumpkins with their little stems pointing up. Our first cut here is at 3 inches, and then we're going to cut that into 3 by 4. So we'll turn our paper sideways and make 2 cuts at 4 inches. The last cut, or the last piece rather, will be automatically 4 inches. I do often like to see if there's a little amount I can trim off because I can get just a little bit off sometimes. These 3 pieces will be labeled 1B. The B has an asterisk by it, which means the reverse side will be what will be seen on the project. So we will label these on the dark side. You might have to look a little bit to find a spot where you can write and still see it. These will go into folder number 1. The next cut is at 3.5 inches. Line up our papers at 3.5 and be sure they are still oriented correctly. We want 2 more 3.5 inch squares, so we'll turn this sideways and cut at 3.5 twice more. Like the other 3.5 inch squares we made, these will be marked as 4B and placed into our number 4 folder. With the piece left here, we're going to trim it down on the long edge to 3 inches. Remove the scrap piece. Then we're going to turn the paper and trim to 4 inches. This again is marked 1B and has the asterisk, which means we are going to use the back side. So put your marking on the dark side and slip that into folder 1. Our last piece of this pattern paper, we're going to cut down to 4 1/4. Let's place our scrap aside, and then we need 1/4 inch pieces. So we're going to flip this over because these are asterisked and we'll be using the back side. Again, I'm going to use the markings to the right side of the blade guide and make 4 1/4 inch cuts. These pieces are number 4C. I'm looking for a good spot to write on them. And they will go into folder number 4. With the remainder of the paper, we are using the asterisk or back side, and we need 4.5 by 2 4 times. These pieces are being cut to use for our die cuts. These pieces are labeled as P3, Project 3, and I'm going to go ahead and mark them in the corner on the front side. We're using these to cut some of our die cuts. If you look at the diagram, you can see that writing in the corner on the front side is not going to be a problem. I'm also not going to put them in folder 3 at this time. I want them within easy reach and not have to dig through the folder when we get to the die cutting part. We will be making our next cuts using our papaya cardstock, and the instructions say we want the light side up, so make sure that you've turned it so that the light side is up. In this case, if there are any asterisks, it will indicate the dark side of the paper. Our little scissor icon indicates that our first cut is at 5 1/4 inches. So we'll measure over to 5 1/4 with the papaya light up. The second cut is also 4 1/4 inches, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that one now as well. The last piece of this page is a scrap, so put it aside and make something fun with it. Our first 5 1/4 inch piece is going to be cut into 4 inch sections. We're going to turn it sideways and cut it 4 to get 3 of those out of this first piece of cardstock. My last piece had just a tiny piece extra, not enough to worry about, and you don't have to cut that little bit off. These are all 3A. We're going to write that on the dark side and slip them into folder number 3. With the next piece, we're going to cut one more 5 1/4 by 4. Oops, I just did 5 1/4 by 5 1/4. Let's scoot this piece back and we'll correct it to 5 by 4. Lucky for me, we're not using the entire sheet of the second piece of papaya, so I will be okay there. Okay, 5 1/4 by 4. I'm going to mark this as A3 on the dark side and drop it into file number 3. Now I can't cut according to the diagram here, but you can. So I'd like you to cut the strip from 5 1/4 to 3 5/8. Then turn it sideways and cut 2 times at 3 5/8, giving you 2 3 5/8 inch squares. Now let's take our second piece of papaya cardstock. Again, we want to make sure that we have the light side up. And we're going to cut a 1-inch strip for 5 1/2 by 1 inch pieces. We're going to again use the measurement to the right of the blade guide, and we're going to cut this 2 times. So there's once and twice. Now we're going to turn these sideways and cut 4 5 1/2 inch pieces. That will give us 4 1 by 5 1/2 inch strips. You may realize I just gave you a good example of why you always want to check your numbers twice, because I just went, right here and just cut right through it and made an error. Which, lucky for me, I was fortunate this time. There's a large enough scrap of a papaya cardstock left over that I can go ahead and make up the pieces that I would have cut off the first sheet had I been doing my numbers correctly. Okay, so these pieces are 2B, and we'll mark them that way on the dark side and place them into folder number 2. Now we'll go back to our papaya paper with the light side up, and we need 2 more 3 5/8 inch squares. So we'll make our first cut at 3 5/8, which is just 1/8 of an inch bigger than 3 1/2 if you have problems with fractions and measurements. Then we will turn the strip sideways and cut 3 5/8 inch twice. This will give us the 2 more squares that we need for our projects. We will mark these as 4A and slide them into folder number 4. Next, we're going to work with the peach cardstock. And again, we're going to cut on the light side with the dark side being marked by the asterisk. So light side up. Our first cut is at 3 3/4 inches. We're going to make this cut twice. And the pieces that we are cutting are 3 3/4 by 5. So let's turn the piece sideways and cut it down to 5 inches. Then take the second piece, turn it sideways, and let's cut 2 more pieces at 5 inches. Then on the dark side of these pieces, we will mark them as 3B and place them in project number 3 folder. Now from the remaining peach cardstock, we are going to cut out the pieces for our banner. These are 1 by 12 inches, and we're going to cut 4. Again, I'm going to use the measurement to the right side of the cutting guide. These long pieces are labeled as P3 for Project 3. Since they are pieces that we will be using to die cut, I'm not going to place them into the number 3 folder, but we'll set them aside with the other pieces for die cutting. Next we'll use our white daisy cardstock. Our first cut is going to be at 3/4 inch. I'm placing my paper on the trimmer left to right and using the right side measurements for 3/4 inch. We need 2 of these cuts. Then we're going to cut each strip down to 3 inches for a total of 8 3/4 by 3 inch pieces, 4 from each strip. First set of 4 will be marked as 4D and put those into the number 4 file folder. Now we're going to start the second strip, cutting it the same way at 3 inches 4 times. Actually, that's 3 times for 4 pieces. And then we're going to mark these as 4E and place them also into the number 4 file folder. Our next cut will be at 3.5 inches. Let's go ahead and cut this size 2 times. The second cut for these pieces is at 4 3/4 inches. We'll cut this twice from each strip. And then hold on to that little scrap piece. That's going to be used for some die cuts. The 3.5 by 4 3/4 pieces will be marked as 3C and then placed into folder number 3. You'll have 2 remaining scraps from these last cuts, and we're going to put those aside to use for our die cuts. Now we are going to cut the remaining 3.5 inch strip to 7 inches. If you look back at your cutting diagram, you'll notice that there is a dotted line across this piece, which indicates that we will be folding it. I'm going to make the fold right now. I'll also burnish the fold with my bone folder to keep the paper from popping open when I use it for the die cuts. I'll place these pieces aside with the other pieces we're keeping separate for thin cuts. We have one more sheet of white daisy to cut. We will cut 4 1 by 12 inch strips for more die cuts. This will leave us with a large scrap left over. I think that's great because this white is the best for crisp, sharp stamped images, and who doesn't want some of that on hand? These 4 1-inch strips will also be placed in our die cutting pile for the next portion of our cutting guide. At this point, we are done with our paper trimmer. I'm going to put it aside and I'll take a moment to pick up my scraps and bring out my die cutting machine. Wow, I sure wish I was this quick and efficient in real time. Before we get into the die cutting, I am going to share this photo in which I have numbered the metal dies. I suggest you copy this with your own dies as it will make it so much easier to follow along if I refer to them by numbers. If you have any trouble determining which dies are which, you can place them on the insert found in your stamp envelope to match them up with the stamped images. Okay, we're going to return to the first part of the cutting diagram on page 2. Notice that the first die cuts are on the striped paper, P3 with an asterisk. It also instructs us to stack these, which means that we are going to cut 2 at a time. Let's go ahead and separate this into 2 stacks. Now we need dies number 6 and number 1. Now we'll place the papers and the thin cuts on the cutting plate and run them through the machine. I like to crank the dies through and then back out for 2 reasons. First, I feel just a little extra sure about the cut, and secondly, I have a very small workspace on the back side of this machine. Backing out means I don't end up shoving it into all my stuff. All of these little cuts are marked P3 for project number 3, so I will place them in folder number 3 and discard the paper that they're cut from. I'll go through the same process with the second stack of 2 pieces of striped paper. I find using my piercing tool as a lifter helps me lift the metal die off the paper and then the paper off the cutting mat. These pieces will also go into folder number 3. The instructions for the next die cuts are using the peach cardstock, but we're going to save those for last when we do the same pieces with the white daisy cardstock. Next, let's do the smaller white pieces that were left over from the first white cutting. We'll stack 2 together and place them on the cutting surface. We will be using the metal die numbers 4, 3, 5, 6, and 1. I'll be placing them in the same position as the instructions diagram. The white daisy is such a dense cardstock that you feel a little more resistance when you run it through your machine, but all your pieces should pop right out of the paper. Oops, I have an almost cut here. An almost cut is one that needs to go through the machine again because it didn't quite cut all the way out. It's easy to put it through the machine again because once the die has creased the paper, you can easily put the metal dies exactly in those creases to recut. Almost cuts sometimes happen when there are 2 or more dies being cut at once. There may be a slight difference in their thickness. Here we go. Our almost cut pops out just perfectly. Using our numbering system, die cut number 4 is for project 1 and will go into folder 1. Die cut number 6 is for project 2 and should be placed into folder 2. The remaining 3 cuts, number 5, 3, and 1, are all used on project number 4 and should be placed into folder number 4. Now we are going to repeat these cuts with our folded piece of white daisy cardstock, so we will have 4 of each die cut. You should find with this larger piece of white daisy cardstock that placing your metal dies in preparation of cutting them is a little bit easier. Again, we will place the die cuts in their appropriate folders. Die cut 4 into folder 1, die cut 6 into folder 2, and die cuts 5, 3, and 1 are all placed into folder 4. Now we are done with the small dies, and I am placing them back onto the magnetic sheet. I love that our dies are all packaged with this magnetic sheet. It is so helpful in keeping them organized and easy to find. Now let's go back and cut the banners. For this, we are using the very long metal die. This is where using washi tape or other removable tape like painter's tape is very helpful in cutting this die. If you only have permanent tape, place it on your skin and remove it a few times to make it less sticky. Also, I do not recommend cutting these banner pieces in stacks as suggested in the instructions. The crossbar on this metal die makes a score mark where the banner will be folded. When stacked, that score mark does not press through the second layer of cardstock very well. Because of this, I suggest you cut the banner as individual cuts, not in stacks as I have in this video. We will cut the peach cardstock first using the light side. Lay the metal die on the strip of cardstock and using removable tape, tape it in place. This is important because the metal die is too long to make this cut in one swipe. You will notice also that if the paper is stacked for this cut, you will need to be sure the paper is taped together as well. Place one end of the die on the cutting surface and angle it from one corner to the opposite corner. The angle will help ensure a good cut the first time. Put your die through the machine most of the way and then back it out. Remove the die, turn it around, and place the uncut end toward the front of the machine, and repeat. Make sure the original cut is still in line with the metal die. Now remove your die cuts from the die and also remove any washi tape that remains on them. You should be able to see your score lines which go across the die. Repeat this process with all 4 pieces of the peach cardstock and with the 4 pieces of white daisy cardstock. Your peach banners will go into folder number 3 and your white banners will go into folder number 1. Now I'll clear off my desk and we'll sort all of these cut pieces into individual cards and ready to assemble. Let's open up our number 1 folder and we'll start by separating all the pieces here into 4 piles. If you like, you can check to be sure all the pieces are appropriately marked with a 1 and a letter. If not, you can shuffle the wayward little piece over to the correct pile. With the banner pieces, we will go ahead and fold them on the score lines so they will fit in the envelopes with the other card parts. Ignore how I am folding the banner in this video. I soon found out that it was not right and all the folds should be made in the same direction, not back and forth as I am doing here. If this does not make sense to you, I will demonstrate it a little further along. It's about through here that I also discovered that the score lines created when stacking the cardstock were not as deep or as helpful as they should be. With good score lines, you should be able to make the folds where indicated without any problem, quickly, easily, and accurately. After struggling with score lines that were not adequately doing their jobs, I decided to use the ball end of my piercing tool and hand score over the lines to make them work just a little bit, okay, a lot better. Now let's take a card base and slip the pieces for 1 card inside, and then place the card base and pieces inside one of your envelopes marked number 1. Do this with 3 more card bases, and now you are ready to put together your 4 number 1 cards on class day. Now let's do the same thing with folder number 2. Let's separate the pieces out in 4 piles, checking that all pieces are marked for card number 2. Then we'll place all the pieces in a card base and slide them into our number 2 envelopes, ready for class day. Now let's repeat this with folder number 3. I like to keep my piles with the right sides up. When I noticed a card number, I realized I had placed some papers upside down, and so went about turning them over. The peach banners for card number 3 is where I realized I have folded my banners wrong. How did I know? By the differences in the color of the front and back of the cardstock. The 3 bars on the front side of the folded banner should be light peach. The 2 bars that peek out from behind should be darker peach. Look for that difference in color to ensure your folds are right. Before folding the rest of the banners, I am going to go over the score lines with the ball end of my piercing tool. I'm placing a paper towel under the cardstock to create a little give to the paper. Now let's fold the banner so that the light side of the paper is always on the outside, front and back. The end result will be like a flattened out spiral. You can make your fold away from yourself or toward yourself, it doesn't matter which, as long as you keep doing it in the same direction. And next, of course, we're going to scoop up all of our card parts and place them into our envelopes that have been marked for project number 3 and place them back into the folder. And you now have 4 more cards ready to assemble on card day. And we're going to repeat the process one more time for card number 4. Sort your pieces into 4 piles, scoop those piles into card bases, and place in the number 4 envelopes for class day. Don't forget to keep your beautiful shimmer trim someplace handy so you will have it on card making day. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you soon.